This podcast is intended as healthcare practitioner education only and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
I'd say across the board, a good 75% of my patients present with anxiety. That's adults and children. With kids, it's certainly becoming more prevalent.
So with anxiety, I would say, of course, the emotional environment plays a big role. Whether there's a harmonious family life, whether the children get all the attention care that they need. Positive parenting is so important rather than punishment, and whether they're well attached to their parents.
This is Bioconcepts Between Clinical Minds, the podcast that's open-minded enough to take in all sides of a clinical story. You'll hear from researchers, doctors, naturopaths, nutritionists, and patients. We look at common clinical presentations through a different lens. It's open, frank, and sometimes controversial. Nothing is off limits. Will it change the way you treat? We'll leave that up to you. In Season 1 of Bioconcepts Between Clinical Minds, we look at children's health. We talk to experts in the field who will take you into their clinics and share their experience. We'll hear the inspirational stories of change from patients and their families along their healing journey. I'm Tony Chambers, and this is Bioconcepts Between Clinical Minds. In this episode of Between Clinical Minds, we talk to integrative paediatrician Dr Leila Masson and Victorian family naturopath Emma Wisbey about the most common mental health conditions they treat in children. Dr Leila Masson is a consultant paediatrician specialising in nutritional and environmental medicine with 2 grown children of her own.
So in my clinic, I see a lot of children with anxiety and OCD behaviors, also ADHD and autism, and some kids with oppositional defiant behavior and just a very low frustration tolerance. So really a mix of all the major mental health issues that we see in children.
And can you tell at all or talk about any of the contributing factors?
Well, I think, mental health and health start long before a baby is born with the mother's and the father's health and all the environmental exposures during the pregnancies and the nutritional status of the mom. So there's so many things that you can do when you're even just thinking of conceiving to get into really good health as a couple, to avoid toxins, avoid alcohol, nicotine, of course. But, in particular, the ones that we can avoid are, for example, mercury and lead. So high mercury levels affect mental health. And our main exposure to mercury is now from fish. And I measure a lot of children's mercury level when they come in with anxiety or depression or hyperactivity. And often they have very high levels, and it's a pure toxin. There is no good amount of mercury in the body. And it comes from eating large fish, because the mercury from the environment settles into the ocean and then settles to the ground and accumulates as you go up the food chain from tiny, tiny little animals or even algae up to the large fish. So if you eat a lot of tuna or swordfish or catfish or any of these, you may have quite a high level of mercury in your body. And that happens also before pregnancy and in pregnancy. So the baby's brain then is already exposed to that. Same with lead. I've had patients with severe anxiety who actually were exposed to lead from antique furniture or, with old paint on it. And that definitely affects the brain. And with everything, I think it's always better to prevent than to have to fix things. So if you can live as much as possible in a toxin-free lifestyle while you're conceiving, while you're pregnant, and then while you're raising your children, you will have healthier and happier children.
Do you see a lot of children with anxiety who have been exposed to mercury?
I do see children who have been exposed to those things, but I also see a lot of kids with anxiety who don't have those exposures, who so with anxiety, I would say, of course, the emotional environment plays a big role. Whether there's a harmonious family life, whether the children get all the attention, care that they need, positive parenting is so important rather than punishment, and whether they're well attached to their parents, that's really important as well. Whether they're stressed at school or bullied, all of those things, very important. And then the next thing is, I think there's these 4 pillars really of good health, mental health and physical health, that very, very few children in Australia actually get. And that's enough sleep, enough quality sleep. We have an epidemic of sleep deprivation. And if you even just sleep half an hour less per night than you need to, you're not going to be as happy and as well functioning during the day as if you had enough sleep. Then good nutrition, and 95% of Australians eat a standard Australian diet. That's why it's called standard, the SAD diet, which is mostly processed and even ultra processed. And that doesn't give you calories, but it doesn't give you the nutrients you need to thrive. So, you may get, a lot of it is white flour and sugar and bad oil. So you get enough calories to grow. And, we have an epidemic of obesity as well because of that, because you get the calories, but you don't get the nutrients. But you're lacking your fiber, your zinc, your iron, your magnesium, all of those, which you need for good mental health and physical health as well. Then the toxins we talked about already, and then lifestyle. So enough exercise, enough time spent in nature, not too much time spent in front of screens. Those are so important. I mean, the generation of parents today spend twice as much time outdoors than the children of today. And, it goes down every year, less time spent outside, more time spent in front of screens. And we're just not evolved to live like that. Our brains are evolved to thrive when we're outside, ideally in nature. There's this beautiful Japanese old custom of forest bathing, which I love, which basically is just going for a walk in the woods, or even at the ocean, or anywhere in a park. And there's a huge amount of research being done into that right now, the effect of being in nature on the brain. And in particular in children, it calms them. It can have as much of an effect on the calming as a dose of Ritalin. It makes them more focused, more creative in their problem solving, happier. And, there was this beautiful book by Richard Louv called The Last Child in the Woods, and he created the term of nature deficit disorder, which has become a big buzzword now because nobody spends enough time in nature anymore, and we need to.
I've got 2 teenage boys now, and I feel like the influence of their peers and the influence of social media, and just the fact that you can't, make them get in the car with you and go to to go for a bushwalk. Do you feel that those influences become too strong in the teenage, particularly in that older group that you're seeing with the teenage?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes difficult because everyone else is sitting in front of a screen, and you can't take a 15-year-old and move her, they have to want to. So I do understand that, but I think if you kind of nurture that love for nature from early on and just make it at least, Sundays, the whole family goes together for a walk or to the beach, just make that so that you have once a week that dose of nature. And then during the week, maybe just if you have a garden or if you have a park nearby, just encourage them. Or if you have a dog, make the kids take the dog for the walk because it is really, really important, And I think the younger we get kids used to it and the more they love it, the more they will do it. So, but I agree with you, their peers, if they fall in with a group of peers that just want to play computer games, it's going to be very hard. So, and you don't have that much influence on which group of friends your children choose, except by, kind of setting them up early for a love for exercise and nature and those things. And I mean, it does make a big difference what you do. It's not what you say to them to do, but what you actually do. Do you go for a walk every day? Do you, model that kind of behavior? I think that's really important as well. And, teenagers are difficult. I mean, I think A lot of kids between 15 and 17 or 14 and 17 won't do anything you tell them to do, but they still watch you and they still take in what you do, and eventually they'll turn around.
Did you ever have to prescribe medications or anything else to them while they're on this journey?
So I always look at what are the nutritional factors that may be lacking. And most of the time, just by fixing those, I do not need to prescribe any kind of medication. And I think, the medication that is approved is an SSRI, and we don't really have great long-term studies on that reassure me that there's no negative effect on brain development by putting a child on that. So I start by examining the child, of course, and looking for clues. For example, if they look very pale, then I think, well, maybe this child is iron or B12 deficient. Are they very tired? Do they have a coating on their tongue, maybe a bad gut flora? Their skin, do they have that sandpapery, rough, dry skin on their upper arms that would make me think maybe low omega-3, which is also really important for mood and behavior. And white spots on the fingernails tell me that the child is probably zinc deficient. And or if they have really red kind of fingertips, if you look at the end of the tips, if they're quite bright red, then that makes me think that maybe the child does have some toxins like lead or mercury in him or her. So, I examine the whole child, look at, are they bloated? Do they have any other skin rashes? And then I usually will order, depending on the age of the child, some tests. If they are old enough and willing to have a blood test, then I'll do a blood test and check for iron, B12, zinc, full blood count. If I suspect that they may have some toxicities, I check for that. There is a specific type of acute onset of anxiety called PANS, where a child has an infection. Then within a very short time after that has an acute onset, a real change in mood and behavior of severe anxiety, separation anxiety, and usually associated with OCD behaviors and sometimes tics. That's called PANS, pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. And if I suspect something like that, then I will also check for autoimmune markers and for antibodies to streptococci, for example, or depending on what infection the child had before that onset, because that's quite easily treated. And so I'll check, quite broadly. Vitamin D is another one I check. And, surprisingly, kids in Australia very rarely have high vitamin D because in the winter, the sun is actually at an angle where it doesn't produce enough vitamin D in the skin. And in the summer, we have to be so careful not to burn that we may overdo it a bit with slip, slap, slop. And the children actually don't get that much sunshine. So if the children are low in vitamin D, that will cause either depression or anxiety or, low moods and can also affect their general health. So there's quite a few things that I can search depending on how the child presents and then treat. And if they have a history of bad, of any kind of gut issues, I may check for gut flora. I see a lot of irritable children who actually have, pathogens like Giardia or pinworms, and treating those lifts their mood very, very quickly, because they can finally sleep well and the inflammation from the gut is gone and they start to absorb their nutrients because they don't have diarrhea anymore. So, there's so many different potential causes for issues with mood and behavior. And it's almost like a detective game, you really try and figure out what it is for each particular child. And once you get it, it's so wonderful to see the child turn around just by addressing that issue rather than masking the symptoms with a drug.
And do you see a lot of children coming in who are already on medications? Because the statistics on children taking medications is actually quite high, isn't it?
Yeah. I see a lot of kids who come in on ADHD medication and are not doing well on it, where the parents say, my child has lost weight or is very, very upset every afternoon when the medication wears off, or it hasn't really helped, and they want to get the child off the medication. And then we can do that. We can, again, with ADHD, you can look for the underlying causes. Very often, these kids are typically the kids who eat an additive-laden diet with lots of artificial colors and preservatives and sugar and not a lot of vegetables and whole grains. and then they don't get enough exercise, and they don't spend time in nature, they don't get enough sleep. All of those things together can make a child present with symptoms of ADHD. Fixing it helps usually, not always, but most of the time.
And what about that histamine balance? Does that come into play with kids?
I mean, I look at histamine in children with allergies, and certainly there are children with allergies who don't have obvious symptoms of allergies. But when you test them, they look, they have the dark circles under their eyes and the creases. And when they sniffle maybe, or have a little bit of skin rashes, but nothing major. And when I test them, they turn out to have quite bad allergies. And when I address those allergies, maybe by taking out the foods they're allergic to for a little while, or by reducing dust mite exposure, that's a very common one, they get much calmer. And I've had children who told their parents, my inner itch is gone. And suddenly they were able to sit down calmly and do their work rather than being constantly fidgety and moving around. So I think, in that regard, I look at histamine and the MTHFR. I find, yes, the MTHFR is a genetic variation, but when you look at methylation, there's so many other genetic markers for methylation that we're finding new ones every few months, that the MTHFR is a little bit of like just a snapshot, really. If people have, like homozygous SNPs for both MTHFR genes that we can test easily, yes, then it may help them to get some methyl B12 or some folinic acid, some methylation support. And clearly it will help them to reduce toxic exposures because they won't be as good as detoxing. And they often do better on that. But I think it's a little bit too limited. I think if you want to look at genes, you actually need to look at a lot more of the genes. But even then, we don't really know the full effect. And even if you have a SNP, you still have there are other genes that overlap with the function of each gene that may take up the function. So I think this is still a very new era, the functional genetic testing. And I prefer the metabolic testing to see how is the child actually methylating, or how, those kind of things. Or how is the folinic acid cycle functioning, rather than looking at the genes.
And what other environmental aspects do you see playing a big role in these mental health conditions that you're treating, apart from the mercury and the lead?
Well, mold is a big one. So Australia is an amazing country. I love it, but there's a lot of mold. So if people, especially if the whole family is kind of suffering, maybe some have more respiratory symptoms and some more anxiety and sleep issues and, various things. And I think, could there be something in the house that is affecting everyone? And I always ask about mold. And often the family says, yes, actually there is some mold. And then I get them to have a building biologist to come and check out the house and remove the mold, whichever way possible. And of course, you can't really just remove mold. You have to improve ventilation. You have to reduce humidity. But there's lots of things you can do for that. But I certainly have seen lots of moms and children who were exposed to mold, super anxious, and once they're moved, that's usually the best intervention. They got much, much better.
For people who are exposed to mold, what are the things that have you used any natural kind of ways of helping these people?
Yeah, so the number one thing really is to remove the mold. Get out of the moldy place. And often it's the mattress. I've had kids who've been sleeping on moldy mattresses, and once they finally looked at the mattress, they saw the black mold and threw it out, and that was the thing to do. Or under the bed or behind, So there's often you can very quickly remove the biggest exposure. And then things you can do is you can use binders. So, short term, you can use something like charcoal if it's really, really bad. But I wouldn't do that long term because it also binds nutrients. But citrus pectin or apple pectin, what you use for making jam, cheap. You can, mix a quarter teaspoon of that and a little bit of liquid or food. and give it to the child at bedtime. And that will bind the toxins during the night so that they don't get reabsorbed into the body and the child can excrete them the next day. And then if the child has lots of symptoms of mold or yeast, so maybe skin rashes or white coating on the tongue, waking up at the early hours of the mornings, like 1 or 2 or 3, and silly and giggly and wide awake, those are kind of typical symptoms of yeast or mold. You may want to use something antifungal. So, there are lots of options like olive leaf extract, tiger. You want to use gentle things in children. You don't want to use oregano oil for months and months, or uva ursi. Those things are a bit strong for children. You can use them short term if you know that the child needs that. But even grapefruit seed extract, I find often helpful. So my favorite is olive leaf because it's so gentle. And you can, and tastes good, and you just start with a low dose. So all of those things can help to reduce mold in the body, and just really making sure that the child has healthy daily bowel motions. So whatever is in there comes out. But as I said, the most important thing with mold is to get away from the mold. Your body will clear itself from the mold over time. And I have had so many patients who said, oh, my child is so, doesn't sleep and is hyperactive and irritable and anxious. But whenever we go on a holiday, the child is completely fine. Or when we go to stay with my parents, they're fine. And, so it is something in the house, and often mold. And when the difference can be very quick.
Emma Wisbey has a naturopathic practice in Geelong with a family and mental health focus. The predominant mental health condition she sees is anxiety.
I'd say across the board, a good 75% of my patients present with anxiety. That's adults and children. With kids, it's certainly becoming more prevalent. Certainly with the recent pandemic, it's either a presentation, so presenting complaint, or in some cases, it's something that we unravel as part of what we're looking at from a health perspective.
What do you think is driving this increase in anxiety? And it is in the stats as well, this increase in anxiety.
I think part of it is the world that we live in. I think it's been very quick transition from, an 8-hour working day where our grandparents had 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours play, through to our kids now don't even get 8 hours rest. They've got school and after school activities and social commitments. So I think part of it is environment. Obviously, we've got technology and screens and stimulating components in our environment that are overstimulating our kids' nervous systems. And then obviously we've got lots of sleep disruption there as well. And just general health, I think, is changing. I think the nervous system is fast sort of being affected by the way that we live our lives.
So how then do you approach a case when you see, a child, let's say, even a teenager come in presenting with anxiety? Where do you start with that person?
There's usually lots to discuss. My first comment usually with the kids and the parents is just reassuring them that the brain and symptoms of the brain is no different to coming in with a skin rash or, a tummy trouble. So just ensuring them that it's not that sort of stigmatized mental health domain of, something that they should control or be able to deal with. So really sort of highlighting to them that it's a physical symptom and the brain is an organ of the body, and we're going to sort of unravel things from the head down. And then we just do the usual case-taking stuff. I just leave no stone unturned, and we go through each system of the body. With kids, I do really like to go right back to mum's pregnancy, birth, whether they were breastfed or not. Most teenagers dislike this part of the conversation because they've moved on from being sort of younger, dependent children, but that really helps us to build the picture. I'm also really keen to know lots about family history as well. We're seeing in the research that, survivors of the Holocaust, certainly the generational patients of generational descendants of those people have got, varying different health complaints that are related. We see it a lot with heavy metals as well, grandparents working in the mines and that coming through with, say, aluminium toxicity in kids. So I think with case taking, we need to go back as far as we possibly can as well. And really then just piecing that puzzle together as best we can. So sort of looking at history, looking at current physical symptoms and that whole person, and then looking at their environment.
When you're kind of unraveling and getting into their backstory, are you finding any kind of common links or common exposures or common backgrounds that are leading to pictures of anxiety?
It more so just to sort of help the parent in particular understand what might be happening, because for parents too, there can be a lot of guilt around their child not feeling well and, having this extreme anxiety, and the parents often trying to say, our home life's great and it's a loving family and there's no issues, us as parents are still together. But when we look back through the family history, it could be that there's some really profound grief or loss or devastation with, grandparents. And so it's important, I think, families to understand that epigenetics is occurring and we're seeing it presenting in our kids more so than we were seeing it presenting in ourselves when we were growing up.
How do we as naturopaths talk to our patients about those things? I mean, giving them supplements and asking them to change their diet is really quite simple for us. But what about those other things about their life that we all lead?
If we're looking at diet, I'd like the child to be involved in that, and certainly teenagers definitely need to be involved in that process. And really, a lot of it comes down to what is attainable for those patients as well. I mean, sometimes we can't change the fact that, they're on a swimming squad plus, so they swim 5 mornings a week plus they've got school. But if we can start to look at gaps in their schedule where we can make changes. So it really changes from individual to individual, family to family, but where possible, working with the child on sort of the things that they can do. If we're looking at lifestyle, we're all well aware that diet and exercise are really important, but I find with anxiety and the nervous system, the one big thing that's overlooked is relaxation, and these poor kids don't know how to relax at all. So looking at things that can be really useful and helpful there.
The teenagers that I speak to are like, oh yeah, we did meditation at school, just meditation, I've done that. It's kind of like we're trying to do the right thing in schools, but it's kind of going over their heads a little bit.
Yeah, and often there's a bit of stigma around mindfulness and meditation with the teenagers too. I've got teenagers myself and they're like, yeah, righto, whatever. So what I often talk to these kids about, especially if it's an anxiety picture, I'll describe their nervous system is like a race car. So they've been born into this world with a really strong nervous system that likes to race 1,000 miles an hour, which isn't a bad thing, but we need to implement things in their day and their week that encourages that nervous system to put the brakes on, because like a race car, you can't drive it and not stop or put it in the garage at night. We need that down regulation happening. And then we really just discuss things that they like. So I'll often ask them about their hobbies and what they like doing, because truth is meditation is any time that our brain is decompressing and that we're sort of switched off for a bit. We've all seen those little memes of mindful versus mindful. And really we're just trying to get kids to understand that. So is it that they love reading, but they don't have a lot of time to read during the week, but could they commit to 1 page during the school days and then perhaps, whole chapters on the weekend? Do they enjoy time with their friends, or do they enjoy time alone? Do they have a particular hobby that they like to do? So really just sort of fleshing out what relaxation looks like. It's quite different for different people. And I think one of the most difficult things we can ask an anxious teenager to do is to lay on their back and meditate for 20 minutes, because it is really hard. Sometimes we can be a little bit negative when it comes to technology, but there are some great apps and podcasts and things that kids can listen to as part of their relaxation regime as well.
And what about from a nutritional point of view, as far as causation is concerned?
So certainly looking at copper and zinc ratios, but I mean, we can even supplement with zinc and get great results without having to do sort of tests and looking at copper levels. I do find that obviously magnesium's a favourite for a lot of practitioners, but ensuring that we're looking at all of the minerals. I think for a long time we've shied away from things like potassium and sodium and calcium because obviously there's research that, dictates too much sodium causes cardiovascular risks, etc. But I do find with kids that whole profile of minerals is really effective. Neurotransmitters definitely fits into this picture, and I'm a huge fan of trying to nut out what's happening with neurotransmitters. It's a little bit tricky with children, sort of primary school age. We do need to be a little bit strategic with our questioning, but I do find that once they hit teenage, those teenage years, we can use things like questionnaires, the MDA, etc., to sort of get an idea of where those neurotransmitters might be fitting. And then from a really simplistic perspective, if we're looking at neurotransmitters, essentially we're looking at amino acids as precursors, which often just brings us right on back to protein. And I would say protein inadequacy is high on the list of things that we need to address with all patients that I see, adults and children. Most Australians don't eat enough protein, which then will impact on things like amino acids and our neurotransmitter balance.
I know that everyone is different and you have to approach every case differently, but is there like a core set of nutrients that you find really work well in most cases?
Yep, I've certainly got my favourites. Zinc's high on the agenda, and if I'm looking at boys in particular, they respond to zinc quite quickly. I do quite like using powdered nutrients too because it gives us the ability to kind of mix various different nutrients together. Vitamin B6 fits in quite often with kids, so sometimes it's a matter of looking at a zinc supplement that includes B6. Magnesium I do like, but I have transitioned in recent times to using more of a profile of minerals rather than just the zinc or the magnesium on their own. And glycine is wonderful when it comes to kids. It looks like sugar and it tastes like sugar, so most kids will take it. But I do get really, really good results with their little nervous system and glycine supplementation. And then occasionally N-acetylcysteine has a role to play with kids and mental health.
I asked Dr Leila Masson what her approach is to supplementation.
So in my first appointment, I go over the lifestyle and I do the testing. And if I clearly have an indication that there are deficiencies, I already start with some supplements. Yeah. So if the child clearly is, covered in white spots on the fingernails and very easily frustrated and explosive and constantly sick and doesn't have much of an appetite, then I'll say, do the blood test. But as soon as you've done it, start the zinc. And if the child clearly has that very dry skin or cradle cap or the sandpaper, keratosis pilaris, I will start them on omega-3 right away. And if they have a terrible gut flora, I may order, test for pathogens, but start them on, if they're constipated, for example, on some probiotics already. And another one that I often start very early on is magnesium, because I think magnesium, we can get enough magnesium through the diet, but very few people get it. 60% of Australians are magnesium deficient. And I always, say a handful of nuts and seeds a day, whole grain, 5 handfuls of vegetables a day. If you do that, you get enough magnesium. But it may take the child quite a while to get there. So I start them on either magnesium bath, like Epsom salt, or on a magnesium cream, or maybe a magnesium powder. And usually that helps them to sleep better, less anxiety. If they get sore legs, like those growing pains, then, that's also a sign of magnesium deficiency. And then if that's resolved, they sleep better as well.
2 other conditions that Dr. Masson treats regularly is OCD and ODD, or oppositional defiant disorder.
So when you're looking at something like OCD, is that mostly associated with the PANS, like you mentioned before, or is it a standalone condition that you find in your clinic?
Well, you can have it as a standalone condition as well, for sure. But I happen to see a lot of children with PANS because there are not that many pediatricians who treat it. So, a lot of them get referred to me. And it's usually a very clear history of, they had a sore throat and 10 days later, suddenly this child who was always happy and healthy became incredibly anxious, refused to leave the house or their room even. and severe OCD behaviors, changes in handwriting, starting to urinate all the time. There are kind of a lot of different symptoms that they can show that are quite typical. But you can have OCD on its own. But I do think that, whatever happens in the brain, whatever you have as a symptom, whether it's OCD or anxiety, in the end, if you looked at it under the microscope, would be inflammation. So in different parts of the brain. And if you can reduce that inflammation by finding whatever caused it, or just, reducing inflammation overall with a healthy diet, maybe some vitamin D and omega-3, some curcumin. There's, so many different things you can do to reduce inflammation. But I would say diet is number one. Then, those symptoms often get better. With OCD, I find N-acetylcysteine very, very helpful. There are good studies to show that it helps with kids that pull out their hair or their eyebrows. And it's a mitochondrial support and an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant.
And what about oppositional defiant disorder? You mentioned that as one of the ones that you treat. How often do you see that?
Quite often. My older son, who's now 24 and amazing, the nicest person you could meet, used to be very opposition defiant. So I developed a real interest in that when he was younger. And what it turned out with him was severe zinc deficiency. He was so zinc deficient that his fingernails were covered with white spots. His skin never healed. So whenever he got a mosquito bite, it just stayed as a sore. And, so he would have many, many sores on his legs. And I never understood, because this was before I got interested in nutritional and environmental medicine, why his skin was so bad. And it was zinc deficiency. And once that was fixed, he was fine. It really was that simple. I mean, I think the other thing he had was a bad gut flora because of the zinc deficiency, he had quite a few infections and therefore some antibiotics, which then affected his gut flora. So, but I find ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, actually is often the easiest to treat. The children who come in with, low frustration tolerance, exploding all the time, very oppositional, are the ones that respond the fastest to, some zinc, making sure all their nutrients are in the optimal range, iron, B12, vitamin D, all that. Looking at lead and mercury, because those are typical triggers for that kind of behavior, and gut flora. And then, of course, all those, lifestyle interventions we talked to, and positive parenting. I think you can so easily get into a negative cycle with parenting a difficult child, where, the child screams and yells and then you start screaming and yelling, and that makes things just worse. Whereas if you can take yourself out of it and just say, I'm just going to take a break and, I love you, but I can't stand that behavior. I'll be back. And I very often recommend the P positive parenting program, which was developed at the University of Queensland.
And I noticed that you are an advocate of positive parenting. Do you talk a lot about that in your consultations with parents?
Yes, definitely. And I give them little tricks to start with. I often refer them to their P parenting program, but also to psychologists who can work with them one-on-one. But, just a simple thing as, it's called the marble jar exercise or intervention, where you just have a glass jar sitting on the kitchen counter or somewhere where everyone can see it. And then you decide on one behavior you want to change. For example, that little Johnny stops hitting little Sophie. and then every time he plays nicely with her, you just say, oh, you did that so well. And in the beginning, maybe just 3 minutes of playing nicely. He said, you did that so well. I'm going to put a marble in the marble jar. And you actually reward all the children in the household so that it's something they do together. And when the marble jar is full, they get a reward, like going to the beach or whatever you decided before and that you wanted to do anyway, but you package it up as a big treat. And the kids get into that. And it is, just so that repetition of rewarding positive behavior, the children actually get into it. And then the next week you choose something a little bit more difficult maybe, or a little bit more involved, and you make that, and you make it known, to the children what you're rewarding so that they know what they're working on.
In the next episode of Between Clinical Minds, we continue the conversation on mental health, this time with Melbourne nutritionist and researcher Jessica Bays, Brisbane nutritionist Deborah Smart, and we'll hear again from naturopath Emma Wisbey. We cover depression and the Mediterranean diet, sleep disturbance and tic disorders. Thank you for listening. We hope this podcast engaged and empowered you. And thank you to all of our experts. You can read more information on each of them on our website, bioconceptsengage.com.au. If you enjoyed this episode of Between Clinical Minds, please refer a friend and share the love. To continue the conversation, you can contact us at bioconceptsengage.com.au, where community is more than a concept.